Rubius, bruv. I'll turn on the light when I start the reading. Saves battery that way. It's supposed to rain soon. Pot chew. Poe. Where is Poe? Hello, Rubius. What is it? The poet Edgar Allan Poe. Save. I got the window or the shade open so I can see when the storm comes in. It's going to be wonderful, bruv. Let's turn this on. Whoa, what happened? Light don't work? What the oh, there it is. What do you got, buddy? I got beer, I got a book, got storms coming. All the good stuff, buddy. What do you got? Whoa, don't go over, fuckface. What do you got? The poet Edgar Allan Poe. What do you got? Man, I forgot to turn off my volume there. What do we got, bros? Who the hell is this? Can't read that shit on the phone. Oh, it's... What's up, bruv? Alright, the poet Edgar Allan Schmomo. 3. Where's that 3? 3. Larner Ziff. Larzer Ziff. Who the hell is Larzer Ziff? Larzer Ziff speaks for many readers when he remarks that society is scarcely depicted by Poe, who is in flight from the social world. Poe, he says, creates caged and claustrophilic works that promise, in lieu of society, psychic wholeness. Ziff is translating the still dominant view of the aesthetic dimension of artistic works in Keats's famous words, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." As we know, Poe's allegiance to what he called supernal beauty pivots on that imaginative assumption, but it pivots to take a sharply critical view. Far from promising psychic wholeness, Poe's works hunt down the fears lurking in that universal valley of illusions called by the world of getting and spending, and even by poets' ideas. But as Mallarmé was among the first to explain, Poe's flight from the social world is a cunning strategy for tracking that world's flight from itself. Do it. Stage managing such flights is the function that society assigns to its masters of illusion, the artists and the poets. When he took on the duties of that office, however, Poe came to a startling discovery. He had become himself an index of the social world he was called to represent and expose. His great French admirers immortalized Poe's discovery with a dark, honorific, poetic or Poetit maudit. The conqueror worm. The conqueror worm is a whistleblower's message in a bottle. Poe's most dramatic exposure of the fearful theater of art. It's all good, bruvs. To bring critical assessment to his compositions, the call and response they undertake. Distant screaming to battering racket, we want to shift attention from the expository features of the poetry. Expressive, referential, thematic, and attend to their aesthetic and rhetorical relations. When we do that, we find ourselves in a theater of language, watching and hearing, as in the Conqueror Worm, musical dramas. The poetry thus subordinates its possibilities of meaning to the chances of a more direct and physical experience through prosody, phonetics, and morphemics. Artful compositions, the poems make a demanding expectation for a reader performance that will reciprocate the original compositional intention. While a poem like The Bells is an exacting instance of these transactions, they emerge everywhere, even especially in particulars, so minute they easily escape attention, like Irene's worms in The Sleeper, or perhaps even more remarkable because more meaningless, her hair. Strange is thy pallor, strange thy dress, strange above all thy length of tress. I'm going to Google. Can't find him. Mike Mario. What's up, Robs? Strange above all the length of her hair. To propose that is to estrange the word strange. As Rimbaud recommended when he advanced the poetics of disordering the senses, or Blake when he wrote in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite, for man has closed himself up till he sees all things through the narrow chinks of his cavern. When societies become caged by moral, behavioral, and religious norms, as they were for Blake, as they were for Poe and Rimbaud, poetry becomes an imperative political resort. This is so poetry does not involve itself in the matrix of worldly illusions, where redemption comes only as another illusion. Poetry works instead to cleanse one's powers of elementary perception, the redemption of sensory experience itself, the chief inlet of soul in every age. Poe exhibits that faith in primary imagination even in his earliest work, the Sonnet to Science. For example, not a seminal poem like The Raven, The Conqueror Worm, or Ulalume. Is that how that's pronounced? Ulalume? It is a work of aesthetic wit, a game he wants to play with the prosody of a foundational Western poetical form. It's a poem where we can watch Poe beginning his education in poetry, its special kind of language, and its special way of thinking. Damn, we're 171 pages in. That's insane. And its special way of thinking. Like science, poetry is a highly rational and analytic discourse. Poe's poetry in particular, but it is not a prescriptive discourse. It is interactive. The game begins with the title, but readers cannot see that until they've finished reading the poem and thinking through it very carefully. With its revival in the Romantic period, Wordsworth and Keats are sonnet masters. The sonnet became a signature form of Romantic expressive poetry. Poe's sonnet fairly flaunts that recent Romantic inheritance. partly through its specific allusion to Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's Etudes de la Nature, partly by directly addressing one of the period's keynote obsessions, the threat that science was bringing to poetry, equally consequential for reading or rereading the poem is Poe's eclectic recovery of an earlier cultural moment. Sonnet to Science is a kind of formal monster, a I know how to say that word. Miscegenated? I don't know. Miscegenated construction of Petrarchan, Petrarchan, Shakespearean, and Spenserian sonnet formalities. Poe's signature formal move, as we've seen, is to depersonalize his poetry. And his signature form of that move is to write ballads that come from an objectified narrator. These are never realistic characters such as we get in dramatic monologues. Like the beautiful women they love and lose, they are abstract figures, as literal as the language that creates them. All of Wallace Stevenson's poetry summons just these kind of creature. In this case, perhaps only the bells comes with a speaker as literal as the one in this poem. The speaker is the sonnet itself, who that has come before us in his, or is it her, full prosodic regalia. He is there to say something important to the poem's other implicit character, science. Like Keats's Hyperion, sonnet is in a lamentable state. An apparently greater power, a new kind of divinity, has appeared, and all sonnet can do is upbraid science for surely his usurpation. But Poe's poem has altogether escaped that usurpation by recreating the event not as an historical or cultural truth, but as a pure aesthetic appearance. Right. The interaction figured in Sonnet's address to science turns out to refigure the relation of Poe's poem to its readers. Sonnet addresses science mournfully, while Poe's poem addresses its readers playfully. The poem is the action of a gay science, for poetry, it turns out, can play at the game of method and technical expertise as well as science. So we learn that there are two ways we can study nature. One studies nature to exploit her resources and mechanize the world. The other, the science of primary imagination, simply recreates the world as a form of truth. Sonnet to Science is an unseriously disorienting poem, but its very schematic character can help us negotiate Poe's two late masterpieces, The Bells and Annabel Lee. I shall discuss The Bells first because its problems help to clarify the general problem of Poe's poetry. And this dude, he makes some sentences. Poe's poetry, problem of Poe's poetry. I begin with something well exposed in the reception history of The Bells, that it has always been judged a very strange poem. That quality is tracked along the three lines that shape every literary investigation: formal study, contextual analysis, and interpretation. In the best studies of poetry, these lines interact, overlap, and are modified to suit particular cases. The reception history of The Bells is regularly inflected to accommodate the special character of Poe's life and work. A good scholarly edition will display the presence of these three lines of study as Mabbitt's standard edition does. His introduction to the poem thus gives summary accounts of 1. The poem's composition, revision, and publication history; 2. The long tradition of interest in the poem as a virtuoso technical performance and an experimental challenge. Is that thunder I hear? An experimental challenge for one of the period's favorite pastimes, spectacular recitation; and 3. A coded representation of a landscape of psychic despair for which Poe and his biography have always supplied both the model and the materials. Reception history is never wrong because its full truth always remains to be seen and re-seen. This means that every reading of a poem is a true reading. Even a refusal to read is a true reading, reflecting as it does a considered judgment of, if not about the poem itself, then about something seen as important and related. Important, if only negatively, to the poem. The more readings a poem draws to itself, especially when those readings express divergent and even antithetical views, the more certain we can be of the importance of the poem. So, do important poems and poetry itself grow inconsequent when readings coagulate and prevent a fresh engagement? So do poems and poets fall out of fashion. When has a reading ever coagulated? In the case of the bells, the 3 general reading protocols are well established. The poem is alternatively a provocative technical exercise, a faith-destroying horror, and or a poem that had a difficult birth and then evolved in radical ways over the better part of a year, while the pervading interest in Poe's psychology often marries interpretive and historical readings of the bells and of Poe generally. The formal issues tend to be scanted, and for very good reason. Poe's formal experiment is a mere sound of jingle bells to some, whereas to others it is the ultimate proof of Poe's craftsmanship. The history of that dividing line achieves complete definition in the case of the bells. Indeed, the enduring scandal of the poem marks it as prima facie or facie, a poem of the greatest importance. But then what is it? Let us go and make our visit. All right, buddy. Let's get on there. The poem was begun when Poe went to see Marie Louise Shaw Houghton in New York in early 1848. Sometime before May, he told her over tea that his mind and feelings were so upset by the noise of bells tonight that I cannot write. I have no subject. I am exhausted. The lady took up the pen and, pretending to mimic his style, wrote The Bells by E.A. Poe, and then in pure sportiveness, the bells, the little silver bells, Poe finishing off the stanza. She then suggested for the next verse, the heavy iron bells, and this Poe also expanded into a stanza. He next copied out the complete poem and headed it by Mrs. M. L. Shue, remarking that it was her poem as she had suggested and composed so much of it. He then slept for 12 hours. As Mrs. Houghton went to make clear, her account represents a psychological interpretation of Poe and his poetry. Arriving in a debilitated and critical state, his vitality was low. He was nearly insane. Poe is temporarily stabilized by Miss Houghton's friendly intervention. She helps him recover his bearings by helping him re-enter his true world, poetry. But the psychic recovery will necessarily be brief. Mrs. Houghton's good intentions were running up against the fatality of Poe, or the myth of Poe, whose poetical world is, like himself, dark and desperate. All this is a story we know very well. It is also a true story, at once factive and mythic. As a good story should be, it also serves as documentary evidence, grounding many later interpretive readings of the bells, not least the standard observation that the poem moves from a world of merriment to a world of ghouls. Investigations into the poem's textual history then emerge with a life of their own, though they are seized by readers like Mrs. Houghton to reinforce the interpretive approach. The original poem of 17 lines expands to the finished work of 113 lines, culminating in the fourth stanza where existence is represented in the provocative, if purple words of Kenneth Silverman as the plaything of a lying sadistic, overlord of life, the banquet of a ghoul god. The banquet of a ghoul god. That textual history may equally turn attention to Poe, the technical virtuoso. Poe will spend many months reworking the poem, completing a final version in February 1849. Here is the author of the philosophy of composition in spades. As happens regularly with Poe's work, both thematic and formal readings pick up the documentary evidence in order to fill out their respective views. But these two approaches rarely find strong points of intersection. And the documentary evidence itself is often presented as if it had no need to address seriously either the interpretive or the critical judgments. Notes on sources, echoes, and allusions keep multiplying. How could they not? Poe is a literary burglar. But they only add to the sharp division of opinion about the poem. Is The Bells an experimental masterpiece or mere verse in full jingling motley? And how do we decide? I don't think we do decide. There is a neglected biographical feature of the bells that can help to clarify both of those questions. It is in fact the poem's most arresting visible feature. The italicized word what that comes in lines 3, 17, 27, 38, and 72. In each case, setting off the movement of each stanza, a pivotal action in the poem's visible language. It is even more important for signaling how the poem's musical structure is being organized. As Christopher Arruffo has shown, Poe's critique of traditional systems of scansion in the rationale of verse centered in his argument that poetic prosody is scoring for performance, that is to say, for oral delivery and recitation. Why do I only buy books from thrift shops? Because they're 50 cents usually. The question of the poem thus hangs upon the question of its versification. What is an aggressive sign to readers that the trochaic rhythm in which each stanza begins should not be allowed to slip too easily or too quickly into iambs and anapaests after lines 3, 17, 26, 38, and 72. How are we to stress or not stress all those otherwise insignificant prepositions and adverbs that launch so many of the poem's lines? It makes a difference whether we read line 4 and so many other lines as well this way, following the rhythmic lead of lines 1 through 3, 15 through 17, 36 through 38, and 70 through 72. How they tinkle, 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 or this way, yielding to the unstressed invitations of all the words that make up so many of the poem's lines. How they tinkle, tinkle, tinkle. I don't know how the difference between that and that, so. Or consider the opening of each stanza. Here are the sledges with the bells, silver bells, What a world of merriment their melody foretells. Hear the mellow wedding bells, golden bells, what a world of happiness their harmony foretells. Hear the loud alarm bells, brazen bells, what a tale of terror now their turbulency tells. Hear the tolling of the bells, iron bells, what a world of solemn thought their monody compels. In addressing those lives, we want to recall the rationale of verse, particularly Poe's comments on the problem of scanning the opening lines of Byron's The Bride of Abydos. Readers of the passage, Poe says, have argued about its rhythm and versification because they've been deceived by traditional rules of scansion, which often put the eye at war with the ear. But he imperiously argues if the disputants had been in possession of even the shadow of the philosophy of verse, they would have had no trouble in reconciling this oil and water of the eye and the ear by merely scanning the passage without reference to lines and continuously thus. Know ye the land where the cypress and myrtle are emblems of deeds that are done in their clime, where the rage of the vulture, the love of the turtle now melt into softness, now madden to crime, and so forth. For Poe, scansion must be true to the customary accentuation of words, as they are always spoken so that the rhythmical must agree thoroughly with the reading flow. Ibid. Everything about poetic rhythm and its underlying music for Poe resolves into recitation, how the poetry is to be performed by the reading individual. But the reading flow of the bells is anything but a foregone thing. The poem is so organized that its readers are constantly presented with difficult and consequential performance alternatives. What puts the reader on notice that recitation decisions have to be made that will materially affect the meaning of the poem? Of special importance, for instance, is the word how, lines 4, 19, 27, 28, 40, 54, 64, 74. How indeed do the different bells sound? And how are these lines to be sounded? Or in the case of the wedding bells, for example, how does their euphony swell? How it dwells on the future is commonplace in a simple expository sense, but if we strongly stress that word how in line 28, other less simple meanings begin to be suggested. Danger ebbs and flows in the music of this poem, but how does that happen, and how do we know it? Poe tells us how. How the danger ebbs and flows, yes, the air distinctly tells, in the jangling and the wrangling, how the danger sinks and swells. In this poetic world, the ears hear more and the eyes see more than the mind can process or the heart can know. While the words what and how, the sounding of those words are strong determiners of the poem's meanings. They pressure all their immediate subordinates, all of the other first words in each line of the poem, to have their sound values declared. The declarations can only be made by readers. In this respect, consider in the fourth stanza the words they and. What is at stake comes out with great clarity in this passage. They are neither man nor woman, they are neither brute nor human, they are ghouls, and their king it is who tolls, and he rolls, 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 a paean from the bells, and his merry bosom swells with the paean of the bells. If in reading recitation we stress those three ands, the meaning of the melancholy menace of the iron bells greatly augments. Correlatively, so much depends on how we recite the sequence. They are, as trochees, as iambs, as spondees, or as some combination of those options, and how we stress or not the first words of these lines. Especially interesting to me is the scansion of line 88. They are ghouls, which runs a prosodic rhyme with lines 71, 78, 81, and 98. In those four instances, the second syllable is clearly unstressed. The presence of those lines thus throws into relief the various options for reading. Reciting line 88, they are ghouls. All three words in the line could easily bear recitation stress, but alternatives are plainly available, not least a sequence of syllables, of stress syllables, and stress modulations. The poem is a challenge to meaning because it is a challenge to recitation. In every line, readers face consequential decisions that will affect the meaning of the poem. What does one do with line 50, for example, by the side of the pale faced moon, or with those repeating lines that repeat the word bells, which clearly run to an ominously long drawn out time because of the words heavily voiced consonants. For that matter, how do we read lines 46 through 50? Do they link to the deaf and frantic fire? Surely one's first thought, or are they perhaps running in apposition with lines 44 to 45, and thus referencing the shrieking bells? Playing tricks with syntax by playing off the prosody is a game poet especially, play all the time. Those games expose Poe's fundamental poetic principle that poetry's mortal music runs an upper current of meaning that allows us to glimpse an undercurrent of more capacious meanings, though all the meanings will fall short of the encompassing harmony that the poetry desires to reach. In the first stanza, for example, the silver bells are perhaps the stars, or perhaps the heavens, or perhaps all three are keeping time, 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 in a sort of runic rhyme to the tintinnabulation that so musically wells from the bells, 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 bells. We will not hear that sort of runic rhyme again until we're far into the last stanza, where it is associated with the time of Silverman's sadistic overlord of life, like the subject matter taken up in nearly all of Poe's important poems. This begins in illusion and ends in fear. Fear, I said. Which is the great truth of Silverman's reading, but that relation of Poe's poem to its metallic subject reminds us that the working is keeping the time of two different temporalities. One rules the sublunary world of the good and the bad and the worst and the best, the city and the sea, for which is the world as well as poets and their poetry. But there is another world of supernal music overruling that sublunary world. To that world, all poets and poetry are bound by faith and desire. All of them, the good and the bad, and the worst and the best alike. It is the cool template by which we are able to see more clearly our world of illusion and torment. So the key phrase, what a world, has a double reference. It is also semantically double jointed. We don't know what the doctor or the double word, oh my God. We don't know what the double word of the bells is, but we do know it is breathtaking. The bells, it seems, is not a what at all, especially poetically. It is more like a how, since it can only be accessed through musical action. The poem's harmony, the reader's subsequent reciprocal performance, and it is meant for a music lesson. The lesson is sent to a world needing clear access to the beguiling, distracting, alarming, and finally horrifying noise of bells. It needs such access in order to realize what it needs even more: music, supernal beauty. pages are in this chapter? Yeah, quite a bit, actually. 18 more pages. Oh my god. The poem's music turns four types of bell to instances of sounds that, except for poetry, would untune the sky. The sound of bells is not the sound of music. It is the sound of the quotidian world, the battering racket about him. Whereas music is the unheard sound of poetry. That is the argument of the bells, and the performance of the poem is the argument's proof, but circumstantial evidence of the poem is the argument's proof. I think I read that twice. But circumstantial evidence can help us recognize both. Pardon. The story of Poe's physical and mental distress on the day the poem was begun has served that function for a long time. Here is another interesting circumstantial fact that a memory of of De Quincey, one of Poe's favorite authors, is attending upon the poem's most notorious word, tintinnabulation. The Confessions of an English Opium Eater has the following passage. It can speak for itself, in which De Quincey recalls his torment by bells when he was at Oxford. The persecutions of the chapel bell, sounding its unwelcome summons to 6 o'clock matins, interrupts my slumbers no longer. The porter who rang it is dead, and has ceased to disturb those who suffered much from his tintinnabulous propensities. The bell rings, I suppose, as formerly, thrice a day, and cruelly annoys, I doubt not, many worthy gentlemen, and disturbs their peace of mind. But as to me, in this year, 1821, I regard its treacherous voice no longer treacherous, I call it, for by some refinement of malice it spoke in as sweet and silvery tones as if it had been inviting one to a party. Its tones have no longer indeed power to reach me, for I am 250 miles away from it and buried in the depth of mountains. And what am I doing among the mountains? Taking opium. Introduction to the Pains of Opium. Freaking pages have I gone? 69 to 82 is only 13. All right. Poe's poem served him much as De Quincey was served by his mountain retreat. But then what of us, the poem's readers? Why has Poe made such a problem of the versification of the bells? Why disorder its prosodic senses as he has so clearly done? My answer would be to disorder our senses, and by that to wake his neighbors up at our most elementary level of human attention. The bells asks us to make decisions, actual choices, about how to articulate its language, and then to notice or realize what those choices tell us about ourselves, for our recitations will reflect our understandings and hence of our world. Williams says that the whole period America 1840 could be rebuilt psychologically from Poe's aesthetic method, and that is both true and important. But equally true and important is how the method was devised for promiscuous interpretive performance. The Bells invites each reader to a deliberated engagement with something that appears inconsequent and even simple, an articulated reading of a poem. But the invitation is full of import and consequence, since we will inevitably find the task seriously demanding. A bad recitation of the bells will have lost all contact with the supernal beauty its music celebrates. It will simply be a jingling and jangling of what Whitman called the ages, in this case, our ages, matter and malady, not a poetic diagnosis, which is what he wanted. Actions speak louder than words, and when poetry is at stake, recitation is more dangerous because more defenseless than interpretation. For what should we think if faced with the test as apparently inconsequent as poetic recitation, we find ourselves weighed in the balance of a little poem and found sorely wanting? Would our incompetence frighten us, or would it be more fearful yet if we weren't frightened at all? I'm going to stop there because there's no damn way I'm reading 15 more pages 40 minutes into this thing. That's 17 more pages. All right, I'm done. That's all, bros. That's all, bros.